Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 21. The captain of the Tankadier faces the risk of losing a 200-pound reward. This 100-mile voyage was a risky undertaking, especially on a 20-ton boat at this time of year. The Chinese seas are known for being rough with fierce gales, particularly around the equinoxes, and now it was early November. It would have been in the captain's best interest to take his passengers all the way to Yokohama, since he was paid by the day, but attempting such a journey would have been reckless, and even heading for Shanghai was risky. Still, John Buns trusted the Tankadier, which rode the waves like a seagull, and maybe he was right. Later in the day, they navigated the unpredictable channels of Hong Kong, and with favorable winds, the Tankadier performed wonderfully. "I don't need to tell you, pilot," said Phileas Fogg as they entered the open sea, "to go as fast as you can." "Trust me, sir, we've got as much sail up as the wind will allow. Adding more won't help and is only useful when entering the port." "This is your job, not mine, pilot. I trust you," Fogg replied. Phileas Fogg, standing tall and steady with his legs apart like a seasoned sailor, watched the rolling waves without losing his balance. The young woman, seated at the back, was deeply moved as she gazed at the darkening sea. The frailty of the vessel she was on seemed all too real in the twilight. Above her, the sails flapped like giant white wings, and the boat, driven by the wind, seemed to fly through the air. Night fell. The moon, in its first quarter, offered little light, soon to be swallowed by the mist on the horizon. Clouds were rising from the east, already covering part of the sky. The pilot had turned on his lights, which was essential in these busy waters, filled with vessels heading toward land. Collisions were not uncommon here, and at the speed they were traveling, even the slightest impact could shatter the brave little boat. Fix, sitting at the bow, was lost in thought. He kept to himself, knowing that Mr. Fogg preferred silence, and besides, he felt uneasy talking to the man whose hospitality he had accepted. His mind wandered to the future. It seemed obvious that Fogg wouldn't stop in Yokohama, but would head straight to San Francisco. The vast expanse of America would provide him safety and cover. Fogg's plan struck Fix as almost too simple. Instead of sailing directly from England to the U.S. like any ordinary criminal, he had crossed most of the globe, increasing his chances of reaching the American continent without detection. Once there, after throwing off the police, he could quietly enjoy the fortune he'd stolen from the bank. But what should Fix do once they reached the U.S.? Abandon the chase? No, not a chance. Until he had secured Fogg's extradition, Fix wouldn't take his eyes off him for a moment. It was his duty, and he intended to see it through. One thing, at least, was a relief. Passepartout wasn't with his master. After the secrets Fix had shared with the servant, it was crucial that the two didn't have a chance to talk. Phileas Fogg, meanwhile, was also thinking about Passepartout, who had vanished so mysteriously. Looking at the situation from every angle, Fogg thought it was possible that Passepartout had accidentally boarded the Carnatic at the last moment. Aouda agreed, deeply regretting the absence of the man to whom she owed so much. They hoped to find him in Yokohama. If the Carnatic had taken him there, it would be easy enough to find out if he'd been on board. A strong breeze picked up around 10 o'clock. Though it might have been wise to reduce the sails, the pilot, after carefully scanning the sky, decided to keep the ship rigged as it was. Mr. Fogg and Aouda went below deck at midnight, joining Fix, who had already taken one of the bunks. The pilot and crew stayed on deck through the night. By sunrise on November 8th, the boat had covered over 100 miles. The log showed an average speed of 8 to 9 miles per hour. The Tankadier was still at full sail, reaching her top speed. If the wind kept up, her chances were good. During the day, she stayed close to the coast where the currents were favorable. By noon, the breeze died down a bit and shifted to the southwest. The pilot raised the poles, but took them down 2 hours later as the wind picked up again. Mr. Fogg and Aouda, unaffected by the choppy waters, ate with good appetites. They invited Fix to join them, and, though he did, he secretly resented it. Traveling at someone else's expense and eating their food didn't sit well with him, but he had no choice, so he ate. After the meal, Fix pulled Mr. Fogg aside and said, "Sir, you've been very generous to offer me a place on this boat, but though I can't spend money as freely as you, I insist on paying my share." "Let's not discuss it," Mr. Fogg replied. "But if I insist—" "No," said Mr. Fogg firmly. "It's part of my overall expenses." Fix, feeling frustrated, bowed and walked away. He found a spot to sit and didn't say another word for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, the boat was making excellent progress, and John Bunsby was full of optimism. He assured Mr. Fogg several times that they had reached Shanghai on time, to which Mr. Fogg calmly replied that he expected as much. The crew worked with a sense of urgency, motivated by the reward on the line. Every sail was pulled tight, every rope secured, and the man at the helm handled the boat flawlessly. It was as if they were competing in a prestigious yacht race. By evening, they had covered 220 miles since leaving Hong Kong, and Mr. Fogg hoped he could reach Yokohama without any delays, which would mean the string of setbacks since London wouldn't seriously affect his journey. The Tankadere entered the Straits of Fukien, separating Taiwan from the Chinese coast. The sea was rough with swirling eddies from countercurrents. The choppy waves slowed their progress, making it difficult to even stand on deck. At daybreak, the wind started to pick up again, and the sky hinted at a coming storm. In the southeast, the sea began to form long waves, warning of a tempest. The sun had set the previous evening in a red haze, reflecting off the ocean's glowing waters. John Bunsby closely observed the threatening sky, muttering under his breath. Finally, he said quietly to Mr. Fogg, "Shall I speak plainly, sir?" "Go ahead," replied Mr. Fogg. "Well, we're in for a storm." "Is the wind coming from the north or south?" Mr. Fogg asked calmly. "South. Look, a typhoon is approaching." "Good. If it's from the south, it'll push us forward." "Well, if that's how you see it," said John Bunsby, "I've got nothing else to add." The pilot took precautions ahead of time. He reduced the sails, lowered the pole mast, and sent the crew forward to the bow. A single triangular sail was raised as a storm jib to catch the wind from behind. Then they waited. John Bunsby had asked his passengers to go below deck, but being confined in such a small, stuffy space while the boat was tossed around by the storm was far from pleasant. Around 8 o'clock, the storm of wind and rain hit them. With only its small sail, the Tankadere was tossed around like a feather by the wind. Words can barely describe its strength. At least 20 times it seemed like the boat would be swallowed by the towering waves behind it, but the pilot's skillful handling kept them afloat. The passengers were often drenched in spray, but they accepted it with calm resolve. Fix cursed the situation, but Aouda, her eyes fixed on her protector, whose calmness astonished her, proved herself brave, weathering the storm admirably. As for Phileas Fogg, it seemed as if the typhoon was just another part of his plan. As night fell, the storm grew even more intense. John Bunsby watched the growing darkness and worsening storm with deep concern. After thinking for a while, he consulted with the crew, then approached Mr. Fogg and said, "I believe, sir, it would be wise to head for one of the ports along the coast." "I think so, too." "Ah," said the pilot, "but which port?" "I know only one," Mr. Fogg replied calmly, "and that is Shanghai." At first, the pilot couldn't quite grasp it. He could barely believe such determination. Then he exclaimed, "Well, yes, you're right, to Shanghai." So the Tankadere continued steadily on its northward course. The night was truly dreadful. It would be a miracle if the ship didn't sink. Twice, disaster nearly struck, but the crew's constant vigilance saved them. Aouda was exhausted but didn't complain. More than once, Mr. Fogg rushed to shield her from the crashing waves. Day broke. The storm still raged with relentless force, but the wind shifted back to the southeast. This was a favorable change, and the Tankadere surged forward once again over the mountainous waves. Occasionally, the coast could be seen through the clearing mist, but no other vessels were in sight. The Tankadere was alone on the vast sea. By noon, there were signs the storm was calming, and these became clearer as the sun sank toward the horizon. The storm had been as short as it was fierce. Exhausted, the passengers were finally able to eat a little and rest. The night was relatively calm. Some of the sails were hoisted again, and the boat made good speed. At dawn the next morning, they spotted the coast, and John Bunsby confirmed they were less than 100 miles from Shanghai. 100 miles with just one day to cover them. Mr. Fogg had to reach Shanghai that evening to catch the steamer to Yokohama. Had it not been for the storm, which cost them several hours, they would now be within 30 miles of their destination. The wind grew noticeably calmer, and fortunately the sea settled along with it. All the sails were raised, and by noon the Tankadere was only 45 miles from Shanghai. There were just 6 hours left to cover that distance. Everyone on board feared they wouldn't make it in time. Everyone except Phileas Fogg, who remained as calm as ever. The boat needed to average 9 miles per hour, but the wind kept dying down. John Bunsby found himself just 10 miles from the mouth of the Shanghai River by 6 o'clock. Shanghai itself lay 12 miles up the river. By 7, they were still 3 miles away from the city. The pilot cursed under his breath. The 200-pound reward was slipping through his fingers. He glanced at Mr. Fogg, who remained perfectly calm, though his entire fortune was at stake. Just then, a long black funnel, trailing smoke, appeared on the horizon. It was the American steamer, leaving for Yokohama right on schedule. "Damn it," John Bunsby shouted, yanking the rudder in frustration. "Signal her," Phileas Fogg said calmly. On the Tankadere's forward deck was a small brass cannon used for signaling in foggy weather. It was already loaded, but as the pilot prepared to fire it using a red-hot coal, Mr. Fogg said, "Hoist the flag." The flag was raised at half-mast, the universal signal of distress. It was hoped that the American steamer, seeing it, might alter its course slightly to assist the smaller boat. "Now fire," said Mr. Fogg. The cannon's boom echoed through the air. Chapter 22. Passepartout discovers that it's always useful to have cash on hand, even at the ends of the earth. The Carnatic set sail from Hong Kong at 6:30 p.m. on November 7th, heading full steam toward Japan. It was loaded with cargo and had a cabin full of passengers. However, 2 staterooms in the rear remained empty, those reserved for Phileas Fogg. The next day, a disheveled passenger with glazed eyes, an unsteady walk, and messy hair stumbled out of the cabin and collapsed onto a seat on deck. It was Passepartout. Here's what had happened to him. Shortly after Fix left the tavern, 2 waiters carried the unconscious Passepartout to a bed. 3 hours later, even in his dreams, a single thought haunted him. He awoke fighting off the effects of the narcotic. The memory of his uncompleted task shook him out of his daze, and he hurried out of the tavern. Staggering, clinging to the walls for support, falling and picking himself up again, all the while shouting, "The Carnatic! The Carnatic!" The steamer was puffing alongside the quay, ready to depart. Passepartout had only a few steps left to go. Rushing onto the boarding ramp, he crossed it and collapsed, unconscious, on the deck just as the Carnatic began to move. Several sailors, clearly used to this kind of situation, carried the poor Frenchman down to the cabin. Passepartout didn't wake up until they were already 150 miles away from China. The next morning, he found himself on the deck of the Carnatic, eagerly breathing in the refreshing sea breeze. The fresh air cleared his mind. He began to piece together his thoughts, though it wasn't easy. Eventually, he remembered the events of the previous evening, Fix's revelation, and the tavern. It's obvious, he thought to himself. I must have been outrageously drunk. What will Mr. Fogg say? At least I didn't miss the steamer, and that's the most important thing. Then he remembered Fix. As for that scoundrel, I hope we're rid of him for good, and that he didn't dare follow us onto the Carnatic like he said he would. A detective trailing Mr. Fogg, accusing him of robbing the Bank of England? Ridiculous. Mr. Fogg is no more a thief than I am a murderer. Should he reveal Fix's true intentions to his master? Was it worth telling him about the detective's role? Or would it be wiser to wait until they were back in London and then tell Mr. Fogg that a police officer had been following him around the world and have a good laugh about it? Probably. At the very least, it was worth thinking about, but first he needed to find Mr. Fogg and apologize for his strange behavior. Passepartout got up and as best he could made his way to the afterdeck. He didn't see anyone who looked like his master or Aouda. Good, he muttered. Aouda must not be up yet, and Mr. Fogg has probably found some partners for Weist. He went down to the saloon, but Mr. Fogg wasn't there, so Passepartout asked the purser for his master's stateroom number. The purser responded that he didn't know any passenger by the name of Fogg. I'm sorry, Passepartout insisted. He's a tall, quiet gentleman, not very talkative, and he's traveling with a young lady. There's no young lady on board, the purser interrupted. Here's a list of the passengers. You can check for yourself. Passepartout scanned the list, but his master's name wasn't there. Suddenly a thought hit him. Wait, am I on the Carnatic? Yes, the purser replied. And it's headed for Yokohama? Of course. For a moment, Passepartout feared he was on the wrong boat. But no, he was on the Carnatic. His master, however, was not. He collapsed onto a seat, stunned. It all became clear to him now. He remembered the change in the steamer's departure time, the fact he was supposed to tell his master and hadn't. It was his fault that Mr. Fogg and Aouda had missed the boat. But even more, it was the fault of that traitor who, to separate him from his master and delay Fogg in Hong Kong, had tricked him into getting drunk. Passepartout saw the detective's plan now, and in that moment he was certain Mr. Fogg was ruined. The bet was lost, and he himself might even be arrested and thrown in jail. At this thought, Passepartout pulled at his hair in frustration. If he ever ran into Fix again, there would definitely be a big confrontation. After his initial panic, Passepartout calmed down and began to assess his situation. It wasn't exactly a desirable one. He was on his way to Japan, but what would he do once he got there? His pockets were empty, not a single shilling or even a penny to his name. Thankfully, his passage had already been paid for, giving him 5 or 6 days to figure out his next steps. He ate his meals heartily, as though making up for Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and himself, treating Japan like a desert where food might be scarce. At dawn on the 13th, the Carnatic sailed into the port of Yokohama, a major stop in the Pacific for mail steamers and ships traveling North America, China, Japan, and the islands of the East. The Carnatic anchored at the quay near the customs house, surrounded by ships flying flags from all over the world. Timidly, Passepartout stepped ashore in this unfamiliar land. With nothing better to do, he wandered aimlessly through the streets of Yokohama, letting chance be his guide. He first found himself in the European district, where the houses had low facades and charming verandas with glimpses of neat courtyards. Just like in Hong Kong and Calcutta, the crowds here were a mix of people from all races, Americans, English, Chinese, and Dutch, mostly merchants ready to trade anything. Passepartout felt as isolated among them as if he had suddenly been dropped into a completely foreign world. He had at least one option, to seek assistance from the French and English consuls in Yokohama. However, he hesitated to share the story of his adventures, which were closely tied to his master's, and decided to explore all other means of help first. Since luck wasn't on his side in the European quarter, he ventured into the area inhabited by the native Japanese. The Japanese quarter of Yokohama is called Benten, named after the sea goddess worshipped on the nearby islands. There, Passepartout saw beautiful groves of fir and cedar trees, sacred gates with unique architecture, and bridges half hidden among bamboos and reeds as well as temples shaded by massive cedar trees. The streets were filled with the delightful scene of rose-cheeked children playing among short-legged poodles and yellowish cats. Passepartout wandered for several hours through the colorful crowd, peering into the windows of intriguing shops. He saw jewelry stores sparkling with unique Japanese ornaments, restaurants adorned with streamers and banners, and tea houses where people enjoyed fragrant tea and sake, a rice-based liquor. As he continued, he found himself in vast rice fields surrounded by dazzling camellias, bursting with color and fragrance alongside cherry, plum, and apple trees that the Japanese cultivate more for their blossoms than for fruit. Quirky, grinning scarecrows guarded these plants from sparrows, pigeons, ravens, and other hungry birds. Large eagles perched on cedar branches, while herons stood solemnly on one leg among the foliage of weeping willows. Everywhere he looked, there were crows, ducks, hawks, wild birds, and numerous cranes, which the Japanese considered sacred symbols of long life and prosperity. Although he had eaten a hearty breakfast before leaving the Carnatic, his hunger was becoming urgent after a day of walking. He decided to keep his spirits up and postpone his meal until the next evening. As night fell, Passepartout returned to the native quarter, wandering through streets lit by colorful lanterns. He watched dancers performing skilled moves and astrologers standing in the open air with their telescopes. Eventually, he arrived at the harbor, illuminated by the resin torches of fishermen casting their lines from boats. The streets gradually quieted down, and the patrol officers, dressed in splendid costumes and accompanied by their attendants, replaced the bustling crowd.